Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone that has joined us from around the globe. My name is Riki Nishimura, a principal at Populous and the vice chair of the Harvard Graduate School of Design Alumni Council, and delighted to have curated this session. If you have just joined us now, I'd like to welcome you to Design Impact 5, Following the Sun, Design Futures at the Intersection of Health, Equity, and Climate Change. Over the last 10 sessions, we've heard from some incredibly passionate speakers with powerful messages. There's no better time than now to address and reevaluate the very issues that impact the success of our cities and the state of humanity. Session 11, Mapping Equity, the Golden Path to Opportunity, seeks to reveal the evolution and impact of mapping and the opportunities that it presents. Whether it's maps of Ptolemy's geography from the 15th century, which attempted to use mathematics to create an accurate rendering of the world, or Mercator's map of projecting the spherical world onto a flat surface that would become the standard method of mapping for centuries, or a situationist map of the city that was inclusive of the role of the citizen, or even controversial residential security maps of the 1930s. These representations of these readings of the world and our cities have no doubt contributed to the evolution of mapping. But on the other hand, the nature of mapping has never really been a simple representation of reality and often biased with purpose. Early maps were navigational, about discovery, and in many, a mere hypothesis. But the intersection of cartography, data, and technology has resulted in new representations and expressions of how we read our cities, allowing us to uncover, but also rediscover complex socio-demographic, environmental, and health data to empower our communities. So is there a way of removing bias when mapping equity with the tools, technology, and the processes we have today? Our three speakers, Felipe Correa, Melly Harvey, and Clinton Johnson, will share their personal and professional perspectives, from delamination techniques of reading South America to creating an interactive map influencing public realm legislation in New York City, to advancing and advocating to recognize voiceless communities through equity and representation with GIS. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this panel, Dishi, a mechanical engineer turned industrial designer and an advocate for gender equity in the design industry. In 2018, she co-founded an IoT company that focused on driver safety and hard tech. She is a current Harvard student pursuing her master's degree in design engineering, and she will further introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Riki. Hello, everyone. Before I introduce our guests, I would urge everyone to write in any questions on the chat box at any time during the talks. Now moving right onto the program. Our first speaker is Clinton Johnson. Clinton leads the Racial Equity and Social Justice Unified Team at Esri. He's also the founder and executive director of the North Star of GIS. Clinton has been an avid advocate for justice, representation, and belonging for the Black and underrepresented population, both in GIS and STEM. And we're really honored to have him here today. Over to you, Clinton.
Thanks, Dishi. And thanks to the Harvard Graduate School of Design for creating this space to have important discussions and for welcoming me to participate today. Hello, everybody. My name is Clinton Johnson, and I use he, him pronouns. I've worked in GIS and IT for about 20 years, and I started my tech career off at the city of Philadelphia, where I was helping city agencies find the best ways to use data, GIS, and other technology to improve services and better meet the needs of our constituents. And throughout that journey, I was always one of very few Black technologists engaged in that work. Even when the challenges centered on the needs and experiences of Black communities, and even though Philadelphia has a 40+% Black population. Now I work at Esri, helping organizations from all sectors from all over the world use data, maps, and science to solve some of the world's toughest challenges. And moving from local gov tech to mainstream tech industry tech has meant that in the course of my work, I see even fewer Black people and fewer people from other underrepresented groups. So, as Dishi said, I founded a community organization called the North Star of GIS, where we work to increase equity and belonging for people of the Black or Black African diaspora in GIS, and we work to promote the use of GIS to advance racial equity and social justice. And it's at the intersection of those two concerns that I believe we're all going to find a wellspring of innovation and increased racial justice. So a lot of the work of GIS and geography is related to doing things that will improve or seek to improve the outcomes for Black communities and other groups that are underrepresented in the tech industry and in the geosciences. GIS has been used to respond to hurricanes, floods, and the pandemic that we're in right now. GIS has been used to plan and design capital investments in infrastructure, and GIS is used in just so many public and private sector areas that impact Black communities. And that's work that doesn't always center racial equity. And that work doesn't often involve Black people who are GIS professionals or geographers or tech folks. Now, we all combine our lived experiences and our expertise when we approach any of our work that we do, whether we do that implicitly or explicitly. So the North Star of GIS works to help all GIS and geography professionals navigate the work of racial equity and social justice a bit more effectively, increasing the expertise in that community. And we also help to get more Black people in a position to bring their full lived experiences to the work of GIS. In fact, it was that grassroots organizing in the North Star of GIS that really led to Esri's relatively new Racial Equity and Social Justice Unified Team, where we focus on delivering geospatial capabilities and providing guidance to help all of our users advance racial equity and social justice. In other words, we help individuals and organizations use GIS as a framework for racial equity and social justice. Okay, but what does that mean? Well, I like to say that we help people to tackle two of the most compelling challenges of our time. The first being how to apply an intersectional racial equity lens to identify and eliminate racial disparities. And the other being how to operationalize racial justice, meaning how to embed positive practices for racial equity directly into the work of organizations. So, by applying an intersectional racial equity lens, we mean using data, spatial analysis, and maps to identify disparities that people experience based on social identities that are defined by themselves and defined, more importantly, by systems at the intersections of social characteristics like race, ethnicity, language, and religion, which we know can lead to racialized experiences, but also other factors like gender, sexual orientation, ability, socioeconomic status, and again, many other social characteristics. All the while recognizing that where a person lives, where they are working, where they're traveling, where they happen to be at any given point in time, really has an impact on how our racial identities are perceived, which ultimately impacts the experiences that we have as we navigate through various spaces. So, furthermore, leveraging a concept of racial equity and social justice streams, Esri provides data, tools, and guidance to help people apply those intersectional racial equity lenses to reveal opportunities to increase equity in the decisions and practices by organizations of all kinds, including governments, businesses, educational institutions, and even by communities themselves. The goal is to help people experience more equitable access to community assets, minimize people's exposures to harmful community conditions, and ultimately create and sustain more equitable health, education, and socioeconomic outcomes. And that work often begins by understanding the current landscape of need and identifying root causes. So I want us just, for instance, to look at St. Louis in Missouri, where families and communities face a history of discrimination in terms of the decisions and practices by government and local business entities. More specifically, they face a history of discrimination based on race and immigration status due to policies like redlining that Riki just mentioned and racial covenants. This map shows the historic redlining maps for St. Louis. For those who aren't aware, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC, was a federal organization that stood up and was retired in the early 1930s. In its time, that organization orchestrated the creation of maps in over 200 cities across the US. And those maps and their related documents directed cities, real estate agencies, and local lenders to segregate communities based on race and immigration status, designating more desirable areas for white families and less desirable areas for Black, Latin American, Asian, and Jewish people. The categories used were A, best, and this was always for upper middle class white families, and these were defined as posing minimal risk for banks and other mortgage lenders. Then there was B, or still desirable. These were generally designated for nearly or completely all white US born Americans. And these were defined as still desirable and sound investments for mortgage lenders. Then there was C, or declining. Now, these areas were where residents were very often working class and or first or second generation immigrants from Europe. So while still white, they were racialized as not quite white enough. And these areas were often where they lacked utilities and were characterized by older building stock. And then there was D, or hazardous. Now, these areas that were designated grade D were designated as such because they were said to be quote unquote infiltrated by undesirable populations. And what did they mean by undesirable populations? Well, they were kind of explicit. They meant Jewish, Asian, Mexican, and Black families. And please forgive me for my use of the following term. These maps and supporting documents called out Negro and immigrant populations specifically. Now, I wanted to be historically accurate and to make it clear that there were times when federal and local agencies were serious about racism. Also, this isn't an open invitation to use that word. So these areas also lacked utilities and were more likely to be close to industrial areas and to have older housing. And redlining, or HOLC maps, and segregation have been linked to community conditions. And in this case, we're going to focus on temperatures as a community condition in neighborhoods. This map aligns historic redlining data with an analysis of temperatures on a day in the summer of 2019. And in this particular map, the bluer areas are the cooler areas, and the warmer areas are indicated with more red. So let's focus on that grade A area circled off to the left there. So when we look closely, we can see that this area that was graded A or a best, and now we know what that means, was one of the coolest areas in St. Louis at the time. Now, these cooler temperatures have been linked to high tree coverage and vegetation. Now, on the other hand, this area that was graded D, or hazardous, was one of the warmest areas. This was, of course, linked with low tree coverage and less vegetation, but also with higher proportions of paved surfaces. This disparities in temperatures may seem trivial to some, but these disparities lead to inequities in outcomes. Outcomes like higher energy bills for people who are likely already being bombarded with social economic disadvantages from other forms of systemic racism and white supremacy, and negative impacts on chronic health conditions, including higher preterm births. And according to the Center for Disease Control, heat islands have a deadly impact on cities like St. Louis, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and more. Moreover, the number of heat wave days has been increasing in many cities across the country. These extreme heat events are expected to continue to increase in frequency and intensity across the US for decades to come. Heat islands and heat waves have also been correlated to increases in hospitalization for cardiovascular, kidney, and respiratory disorders. And the CDC has been clear that heat islands claim lives. Deaths related to heat include heat stroke, respiratory disease, and more. And as I said earlier, Esri provides lots of data to help folks to apply the most appropriate and the most intersectional racial equity lenses to unravel these issues and ultimately to design more equitable anti-racist futures. And the North Star of GIS helps organizations apply those lenses inward to ensure that the communities that we all serve are more equitably represented within the work of GIS. And while the North Star of GIS focuses on the Black diaspora in GIS, we partner with other organizations to help other underrepresented groups, and we offer resources to help bring those who are in the margins into the center. Next slide. So in addition to data and practical guidance, Esri recognizes that people need tools that they can use today to tackle common equity concerns. They need abilities to help map and analyze inequities, and to map and analyze the landscape of opportunity. They need to find ways to operationalize racial justice, embedding equity directly into their business practices. They need to continuously monitor operations to ensure that their efforts have the impact they seek, and they need to maintain open dialogue with communities and other key stakeholders. So we provide what we call racial equity configurations and solutions focused on many of those common equity challenges. So we provide tools to help folks to map and understand racial inequities in their communities and identify populations of concerns and the concerns that they have regarding inequities. We help folks operationalize racial justice by infusing equity directly into workflows using apps for automation like surveys and field operations tools, and urban for helping to embed those practices directly into planning activities. And we help folks to assess the impact of their efforts on communities, ensuring that their efforts have the outcomes they seek. And of course, we help folks to engage communities all along the way using tools like story maps that put interventions and policy work in context with the racial inequities that they're trying to address. And we encourage folks to use surveys to connect with the community members, community leaders, and community organizers to ground truth their understanding of community needs, engage experiences that folks in the community have with the resources that are available to them and the conditions that they experience. So hopefully you can see that Esri provides comprehensive GIS and location intelligence resources to support a broad range of racial equity and social justice initiatives. In many ways, these resources reflect emerging and best practices for advancing racial equity and social justice that leaders have been working to evolve literally for centuries. And all we've done is try to infuse those positive practices for racial equity and social justice with positive practices for GIS and geospatial. And we intend to continue to evolve that guidance and evolve the capabilities that we provide as your needs and your efforts to address racial equities evolve. So if you want to learn more about how you can begin to use GIS to advance racial equity and social justice, or you just want to learn what other people have been doing along those lines, please visit esri.com/racial equity to find guidance and customer examples that demonstrate how effective GIS can be as a tool for driving and advancing racial equity and social justice. And if you want to learn more about the North Star of GIS and to support our mission, please visit gisnorthstar.org and find us on social media platforms like Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Patreon using @GISNorthstar. So I want to thank everybody for listening to me today, and a special thanks to the Harvard Graduate School of Design, again, for making space for these very important conversations. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other speakers today and taking on some questions from the audience. Thanks again, Dishi.
Thank you so much, Clinton. It's absolutely fascinating to me how accurate mapping can really reveal trends that are so hard to see otherwise. On that topic, I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Felipe Correa. Felipe is a Harvard GSD alumnus and is currently the Vincent and Eleanor Shea Professor and Chair of Architecture at the University of Virginia. He's the founding and managing partner of the Somatic Collaborative and has been previously involved with the GSD both as a professor and a director of the urban design program here. We are thrilled to have him on the panel. The stage is all yours, Felipe.
Good afternoon. Absolutely delighted to be here. And before I start, of course, a huge thank you to the GSD Alumni Council, to Riki, Dishi, Pancho, and all the organizers that have made such a wonderful event possible. Today, I would like to focus my presentation on the role that mapping plays in the work developed through my design practice, Somatic Collaborative, in collaboration with Anthony Achavati and Devin Dobrowolski, and build upon the play on words of the panel's title, Mapping Equity, which in my eyes emphasizes the value of drawing as a way to uncover spatial relationships that are invisible to the naked eye. While 50% of our work involves more conventional design projects, the other half focuses on broader applied research projects, mostly at a territorial scale, where drawing is critical in describing urban form and processes of urban formation. It is this applied research work that is perhaps more central to the topic of this panel. For us, The act of description through drawing is a process that is not synonymous with design, but for sure simultaneous. It is this continuous exchange between cartographic work and design action what drives our practice and what we define as building a culture of description, with a strong reference, of course, to the work and writings of the great Manuel de Sola Morales. Today, I would like to briefly share 3 applied research projects that examine the relationship between architecture and territory in the context of South America. Rather than presenting the projects in full, which would be an impossible task in the 15 minutes allotted, I would rather show how key drawings across multiple scales frame the thesis of each project. The first project is Beyond the City, Resource Extraction Urbanism in South America, originally presented as a book, published in English by the University of Texas Press in 2016, and later translated to Spanish by Editorial Reverte in 2018. The volume presents a larger history of the economies of resource extraction within the interior of the continent, focusing on the infrastructural relationships between sites of extraction, major port cities, and global markets. The primary objective of this project was to better contextualize the Initiative for Regional Integration in South America, IRSA, the systematic construction of 10 east-west bioceanic corridors that link Brazil with ports in the Pacific Ocean. While IRSA is cast under the light of broader economic development, its primary objective is to shorten shipping times from Brazil to Asia and tap into natural resources in extremely remote and ecological delicate areas of the interior. This is the most aggressive transcontinental integration project ever planned for South America. Given this context, I wanted to understand the larger history of resource extraction and its effects on the urbanization in the region. In order to place the IRSA project in relation to other historical projects that have claimed to tame the South American hinterland. If in the North American context, the notion of the new frontier was defined by Frederick Jackson Turner as a westward moving target that allowed for the transformation of the primitive economic and political conditions of the frontier into the complexities of city life. In the case of South America, it has been a gradual movement inward, exemplified by the Grand South America Canal, a project originally conceived by Alexander von Humboldt in the 19th century and championed by many leaders in the region. The canal was to link the Orinoco, Amazon, and Paraná rivers to construct a major shipping artery that would allow for the interior of the continent to connect with global markets. While the canal was never built, it exemplified the importance of urban infrastructural projects in establishing the links between resources, port cities, and global markets. The previous drawings show regional flows that have a direct impact on precise design interventions. A case in point is the network of oficinas salitreras, or nitrate extraction towns, within the Atacama Desert in Chile. The backbone of the Chilean economy during the first half of the 20th century, more than 100 ready-made company towns dotted northern Chile. While at first hand, these might seem like autonomous superblocks that resemble Renaissance military cities by Scamozzi, a more nuanced look at them revealed that they are part of a much larger territorial network, composed of Indian oasis towns that provide food and water, railroad towns, and port cities that link these superblocks in the desert to a larger territorial network. In many ways, the network of over 100 nitrate towns exemplifies Patrick Geddes' claim that you first need a region to have a city. Today, this network of towns opens an important discussion of equity. How do we guarantee economic sustainability for many of these towns once the resource that created them dries out? Natural nitrate extraction is no longer profitable, yet urbanization in these areas persists. The work of Beyond the City was also presented in an exhibition format as part of the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennial. At the biennial, the historical work was presented in contrast to contemporary patterns of resource extraction, looking at 5 key resources: the continental networks they built and their global distribution. In this context, we can also begin to see larger issues of equity and environmental justice. For example, one of South America's biggest export is virtual water, H2O that is extracted through high water agricultural crops, such as soy and broccoli. The cartographic work was presented through 5 light boxes, 1 per resource, that layered territorial information. The boxes were wrapped by a curtain that depicted quotidian household items that are made with each of these resources, establishing a link between everyday images and larger data sets. The second project that I would like to showcase is Sao Paulo, a graphic biography, a project funded by the Haddad Foundation, and that originally tasked us with looking at alternative futures for post-industrial land along the Tietê River. If indeed the original mandate of the project asked us to promote a restructuring of derelict inner city land through 4 lenses: housing, hydrology, mobility, and block structure, our broader research interest was in also producing a larger graphic history of the urban form of Sao Paulo and visualize how a town of 50,000 people in the 1850s became the manufacturing heart of South America and is today a metropolitan region of close to 30 million people, depending on how you count. If the metropolitan region of Sao Paulo would be a country, it would be the 3rd largest economy in Latin America after Mexico and Brazil. Key to this project was to examine Sao Paulo's condition as a nodal point between the Port of Santos and the Brazilian interior, serving as a hub that connects resources from the interior with global markets. The first portion of the book draws the history of urban form of Sao Paulo through 8 different lenses. It builds, through drawings, a narrative that synthesizes the major forces that have shaped the city over time, and the utilitarian attitude towards its river, always put to the service of a burgeoning manufacturing economy. In less than 100 years, the confluence of the Tietê and Pinheiros rivers, originally a free-flowing floodplain, was hyper-engineered in order to canalize the river and produce dry ground for the urban development along its edges. Here we can see Sao Paulo and its floodplain in the 1840s. In 1942, we begin to see the rectification of the river. In 2018, a fully engineered canal. And here you can see our 2035 vision plan, which argues for giving the river the urban space, giving back the urban space it deserves, replacing the utilitarian relationship between river and city with one that places the Tietê as an important civic and environmental anchor in the development of the city. In this next slide, you can see our project as presented in Folha, the main newspaper in Sao Paulo, where we advocate not only for its role as a new public space, but also as an essential operation that can help mitigate acute water management issues in the city that are further compounded by climate change and can give a new lease on life to this central yet highly disconnected part of Sao Paulo. Ultimately, the last set of drawings that I would like to share today are from our ongoing work on the city of Manaus in Brazil and our broader research on urban Amazonia. I would like to start with this drawing, a bird's eye view of the Amazon seen from the Atlantic. For us, it is critical that drawings have a point of view, a way to bring the viewer into the scene per se. In this case, we rethink the traditional top-down view of the Amazon River forest, ubiquitous to Google Earth, with a perspective that shows the relationship of the basin to the Andes mountain range. Key here is to highlight how the snow-capped mountains along the Andes are an integral part of this ecosystem, since much of the livelihood, if not most, of the Amazon relies on continuous water flow from the melting Andean snow, making rivers the key link between mountain and rainforest. The city of Manaus, sited at the confluence of the Amazon and Black Rivers, is at the epicenter of this ecosystem. Once the capital of rubber, today the city is rethinking its economic base. And as part of this larger initiative, it is also examining its relationship to the rivers and thicket that surrounds it. While at first sight, the city might seem disconnected from the river and forest, a more careful examination of its topography reveals a very porous relationship between water and land, with a myriad of inner city rivers that have been forgotten or have become de facto city dumpster. Our project looks at one of these rivers, the Mindu, and argues that this leftover swath of land that connects the main Black River with the Adolfo Duque Natural Reserve can become the epicenter of a series of urban projects that can help rethink the relationship between city, water, and forest. A careful reading of the way urban elements intersect with the river, including road network, residual public land, and key adjacent parcels, set the stage for the siting of 5 key urban types that bring together housing, social and recreational programs into the river grounds. These types, along with a larger initiative to clean the river's water, set forth a restructuring project that is built in fragments and gradually over time. Here we can see how from 5 precise types, we build a larger urban project that is catalyzed from precise architectural interventions. And finally, a view of how this project was recently presented as part of the 17th Venice Architecture Biennial. Ultimately, while these broader applied research projects are not meant to be built tomorrow, the exchange between description and projection is meant to set the stage for discussion in order to build momentum and debate for future large-scale urban interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think I loved the presentation, and the fact that this was at this scale, I'm sure came along with a lot of challenges. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you about that during the panel. Once again, reminder, please put down any questions in the chat and we'll get to them right after the talks. Our next speaker this afternoon is Melly Harvey. She's a senior computational designer at Sidewalk Labs, where she builds and develops softwares to help city planners and real estate developers to make balanced decisions about new and upcoming projects. More recently, she created an interactive map of the New York City to show where social distancing is possible. She has a master's in city planning from MIT and a bachelor's of architecture from the Syracuse University. We are so delighted to have her on the panel today. Melly, all yours.
Great, thank you, Dishi. My name is Melly Harvey. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a senior computational designer at Sidewalk Labs. I'm really excited to be here today, and thank you to the Harvard Alumni Council for inviting me. And so my background is in traditional design and consulting services as both an architect and a city planner. However, now I find myself working on tech products, writing algorithms that are embedding some of my domain knowledge and making it more accessible. And so today I would like to talk about the topic of mapping equity through 2 projects that I've been working on. The first is Dell, which is a software product by Sidewalk Labs. The second is sidewalkwits.nyc, which is a citizen mapping project that I worked on during the pandemic. And these 2 projects both exemplify how mapping tools and capabilities are expanding to groups that historically haven't had access to the ability to access them or use those mapping tools. And so this is really changing how decision-making is being made in cities in a way that I believe is better for cities. And so at Sidewalk Labs, we're creating products and places with the goal of improving the quality of life in cities. And Sidewalk Labs is an alphabet company, so we're one of the bets. And we share this title with a number of other companies like Waymo, for instance. And at Delve, we're aiming to be a digital master planning solution. And so our mission is, again, to improve the quality of life for all in cities, but through holistic, quantitative, and transparent urban design. And so I'm going to talk about each of those terms. It's meant to be holistic in that we want to understand design through many lenses, not just a single lens, so not just through finance or design or environmental impact. It's intended to be quantitative in that we really want to measure designs at the outset while master plan designs are actually being generated. And this is because normally designs get produced and then they get measured after the fact during some kind of impact review. And we also hope to be transparent. And so traditionally, master plans often are generated in the head of a very talented but very singular architect or designer. But we would like to make that whole process a lot more collaborative. And so something that we recognize is that 80 to 90% of real estate development's value is actually created during pre-development. And so most of the major decisions about where to build, what to build, and how much to build are decided during this phase. However, it suffers from a number of challenges. including due diligence that's decentralized and done by different parties. It's only possible to look at a number of different master plan design options because it's really time consuming to create those options. It's also hard to understand financial impact when there's a number of unknown scenarios. And there's also many different stakeholders that have differing objectives about what a new master plan or a new neighborhood should look like. And so we created Delve, which is, it's actually a web application, but it's also a process for how real estate developers, their design teams, and other stakeholders within the city can work through these pre-design phases of master plans and large developments. And so this process promotes collaboration from the start. It's intended to save time and allow the team to move fast. And it's also intended to uncover the best design options and increase financial returns, but while also being able to prioritize other outcomes as well. And so we go through several steps. The first step is that we ask our users and stakeholders to input constraints, as well as select what outcomes they want to prioritize. In the next step, we generate hundreds of design options, and then we score them and rank them by measuring how well they perform against those outcomes. And then the third step is that we provide collaboration tools that allow for feedback and interaction between stakeholders to discuss the designs. And this is a three-step process that can be repeated multiple times for a project. And so once you get to step three, it's really the starting point for the next round or the next phase. And so you might ask, what can we optimize for? And really anything that we're able to measure. Right now we have a number of outcomes that you can optimize for. Things like yield and programs, so the number of units or affordable units, design priorities like parking and circulation, quality of life metrics such as walkability and views, but also financial outcomes like profit on cost. And next, I'm going to be talking about a project that I did called Sidewalk Widths. So I was fortunate that Sidewalk Labs gave all of its employees extra time every week in order to volunteer in their communities during the pandemic. And so when we had this opportunity, I decided to embark on this mapping project of mapping how social distancing is difficult or easy within public spaces in New York City. And so as most of you know, when the pandemic hit, pretty much overnight, our understanding of public space turned upside down. All of a sudden, everyone became really hyper aware of what qualities of public space were impacting their ability to maintain social distance. And one of these qualities is sidewalk width. And for anyone that's lived in New York, you know that sidewalk widths vary pretty significantly within the city. So you have places such as the financial district, which often have extremely narrow sidewalks. And other places like Malcolm X Boulevard in Harlem that has very wide sidewalks. And at the same time, during the pandemic, you had all of these different uses vying for sidewalk space. So in this one image I took, you have streeteries, you have a runner, you have lots of delivery bikes that are trying to find a place to park. So there were a lot of extra pressures being placed on sidewalks during this period. And so I thought it would be useful to create an interactive map of sidewalk widths for New York City. And I did some preliminary searching and found that there was no such data set of sidewalk widths. It seems like a pretty basic data point, something that the city might have, but they did not. And but that being said, I went to New York City's open data, which is where many of my data projects start. And I was able to find a data set that had the outlines of sidewalks. But because sidewalks can be very complex shapes, like you can see Central Park in this image, the sidewalks are not, it's not straightforward how you would measure this. And so I ended up coming up with an algorithm that was efficient enough to measure the sidewalks, that I could actually do it for all of New York City. And so I created this data set, and I ended up creating an interactive map that I put at sidewalkwidths.nyc. And this map is available to anyone who lives in New York so that they can go and view it. And this map lets you zoom out and see the patterns of sidewalk widths across the city and how they vary by neighborhood. But it also lets you zoom into specific streets and see how wide sidewalks are, perhaps in your neighborhood. And I also offer suggestions as to where social distancing might be difficult or might be easy. But ultimately, I have a disclaimer that it's not really meant to be used to make decisions about your trips or to impact your own safety as you navigate the urban environment. And so I made this map, and the first thing I did after was post it to Twitter. I'm actually part of a pretty vibrant community of citizen mappers in New York City. And pretty quickly they started sharing it, and it ended up getting distributed quite widely. And I was getting lots of responses from people that were saying about how either accurate or inaccurate the map was, and they were taking photos of sidewalks in their neighborhood and sharing them on Twitter. So it's super exciting. I think the intention here wasn't, again, to have a resource necessarily, but it was to really create a discussion around public space and our use of public space. And so eventually this map and data set made its way into the hands of people in several city departments, like the Planning and Transportation Department in New York City, as well as advocacy groups like Transportation Alternatives. And so the map was actually used as justification in City Council for the open streets legislation, which ended up closing close to 100 miles of streets to cars so that they could be used primarily by pedestrians and cyclists in the city. And so this was a super exciting outcome. I've also been working with some of the city departments and reformatting and the data itself so they can use it for their own purposes, for things like understanding sidewalk dining, for instance. But perhaps the most exciting part of this project is that it was duplicated all around the world. This is just a handful of some of the other cities where they created sidewalk width interactive maps. And they actually did it using my code. So I posted it to GitHub, which is an online platform for sharing and collaborating on coding projects. And to my surprise, there are amateur mappers around the world that were really interested in this project and wanted to make their own version. And so many of them did it without me even knowing. So I had really very, very little influence or involvement in these projects. Maybe they would email me to ask me a few questions. But for the most part, this was all done in a very distributed way. And in some cases, these maps were, like in New York City, they were also very important in being part of advocacy campaigns to close streets to cars and open them up to pedestrians and cyclists. This project definitely shows that citizen mappers can harness open data in order to generate insights about public space and influence public policy. And this is possible because both because mapping tools and knowledge are becoming more accessible, but also that public and city departments around the world have invested in open data, which is their resource to create these fantastic data sets, but individuals like me could never map all the sidewalks in New York City. And so traditionally mapping has only been performed by those that are the best resourced. And for our streets, that means that transportation departments that focus on cars have generally dominated what gets mapped. And so mapping things like sidewalk width seems simple and straightforward and seems useful, but up until this point, no one has mapped it. And so cities should continue to support these types of projects through making open data available and interacting with these mapping communities. And I think this project, along with Delve, really shows how mapping capabilities and quantitative analysis are expanding into new groups and becoming much more widely accessible. And that really starts impacting the decisions we're making in cities, hopefully for the better. So I will conclude there, and thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Millie. That was amazing. I think it's really fascinating that you created something out of need and necessity during the pandemic, and then it was replicated in so many cities, which kind of shows that people want this. There is a need and desire to have accurate maps. And yeah, I think that's something that's applicable to all of the projects that were shown today. And with that, we can move on to our Q&A session. Great. So I think my first question to start the session off is to everybody here, which is dealing with data and talking about mapping very specific or underrepresented groups. I'm sure that there is a lack of availability of these resources and data, and there are probably gaps in data that you would have identified while building these maps. So how did you go about filling those gaps or identifying ways around it, I think is the question.
I mean, I'm happy to go first, but it's like a cheat move because the Esri's Living Atlas is a repository of data from thousands of sources, including the Census Bureau equivalents in other countries. So in the U.S. context, that's pretty helpful because there's a fair amount of data on racial identities, sex assigned at birth, sort of detailed racial identities. And I should be clear that not race as we define it, but race as the federal government defines it, which has its challenges. And that's generally useful. However, when it comes to relatively small populations of non-white communities in particular, sometimes the margins of error on that data are as large as the numbers themselves. So that can be challenging. I think people have a lot of success when they look at the census tract level, but sometimes aggregate to county level to sort of spread out the margin of error. But for the most part, in big cities, you can get a pretty good sense of where there are inequities, particularly in terms of race and ethnicity, and income, when you apply that data to other defined metrics, like perhaps someone has determined that there's an air quality standard from very low to very high, and they've spread that across a community. Well, you can fairly easily, using U.S. Census data in a U.S. context, figure out across a whole county, what percentage of each race group is in each of those categories. That kind of thing works pretty well. So it definitely is a matter of trying to figure out, number one, is the data available, how to deal with margins of error. Number two, how well does the concept of social identity, racial identity that's captured in data relates to the concepts of those, social identities and racial identity that you're looking to map and understand. I don't know if that was helpful.
No, yeah, that was great. I think that also gets to the point of, can you only map what is available? And if you wanted to map something completely different, then how would that, but if anyone else has any views on this, please.
Yeah, I mean, I will add to what Clinton was saying, and also build on what you just said right now, which is that I think a critical part of our job as architects is translating data into applicable knowledge, right? And part of that also involves understanding that the data that we're looking at is not neutral. Somebody set sort of the standards for how the data is collected. And that in many cases, we might have to interpolate that data and sort of cross-reference it with other data that might not come in traditional sort of ArcGIS forms, right? And I think that that's where, for example, the relationship between other forms of archival material, historical maps, et cetera, and sort of ArcGIS becomes extremely important. So for me, what is most relevant in these processes is not if the data is fully available, but what are the questions that you need to ask to be able to build an argument with a particular hypothesis that you might already have in mind?
Yeah, I would definitely echo Felipe's point. That's really important, and it's something that we think about a lot on Delve, because we can only build a product based on the data sources that we have and how those data sources were collected. What data sources we have access to really influences what we can measure for, and what we measure for influences the outcomes. And so, like, it's definitely a challenging topic. I'll also say, in terms of the sidewalk width, I was really surprised what the gap in data between car-oriented data versus pedestrian-oriented data, and not just for able-bodied pedestrians, but also for people with disabilities. There's an incredible amount of data that seems to be missing that influences people's abilities to get around streets, whether that's sidewalk widths or curb cuts, or even the amount of time between walk signals when you're crossing a street or at an intersection. And so these are all important data points that we just don't have available.
And if I could just real quick, before we move off of this topic, what Mele did in her work was really important. When the data didn't exist, she found a way to create it, right? So I think sometimes the existence of data can be a bit of a distraction, because 20 years ago, there was almost no data, almost no spatial data. So folks had to create it. And around, generally around business imperatives. So now we're talking about community imperatives and empowering communities to capture data in the context that they need, in the narratives that they need, in the framings that they need. And in the same way that technology is increasingly available to use data that exists, technology is increasingly available to collect new data as well. And we need to find ways to encourage people to continue to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that brings perfectly into the next question, which is from the audience, which is, why do we need to map inequities only and not assets that are inherent in a community?
I don't think that we do need to map inequities only. And I think in the ways that people map inequities, they're actually sort of they're looking at where opportunity exists and where opportunity doesn't. But there are a lot of folks who are also very much focused on mapping opportunities. And really the work of anti-racism and pro-equity is about mapping opportunity and identifying those assets and resources that can create change, and not just reflecting on the current state and the past of where we are today, but influencing and impacting the design of the future by saying, hey, those are really valuable resources that those communities have over there, likely white communities, likely affluent communities. Let's give some of those communities to historically disenfranchised Black and Brown Latinx communities and other communities that are usually in the margins.
Yeah, it also gets to the point of, you need to maybe map inequity to realize where the intervention lies, and then lead to opportunity, which is exactly what our session is called. Felipe, Mele, do you have any inputs on this?
Yeah, maybe what I would argue, at least in my work, but I think it comes across in the work of others as well, is that we're actually mapping spatial, social, and cultural relations, right? And it's how we interpret those, where we can actually find, in certain ways, moments of inequity, and others moments of where we sort of find certain assets that perhaps were invisible to the naked eye. So I think for me, what becomes key is the interpretation of this information, and that's why the dialogue between sort of mapping or drawing, in the way that we call it, and projecting is essential.
Yeah, and I would just add that if you're not taking equity into account, you are doing yourself a disservice. And the example, the sidewalk widths, is one example where I wasn't really resourced to take this a step further, but obviously who is a pedestrian and who's in a car intersects with a lot of other aspects of people's identities. And so in some ways, if this was a project that was going to more seriously underlie public policy, we would need to know what that intersection is and what influence policies around sidewalk widths would have.
Yeah, I would argue that if any time you're not accounting for equity, you're masking, sustaining, and perpetuating inequity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also about knowing who is at the center of your map, who is going to look at this map and what they might take away from it. And how do you prioritize that when you're trying to balance what you want to map and what data is available and who is going to be like drawing insights from it? What does that balance look like?
I mean, I would sort of add to, I think that that's actually a very powerful comment. But I would say that the power actually of mapping is that you cannot fully predict how people are going to respond or react to you, right? That they're both literal, but also literary, that they have the possibility of inspiring many alternative ways of reading certain conditions. And I think for me, that is sort of the greatest sort of instrumentality or power that mapping has.
That's exciting, but also has its risks, right? Because these maps don't exist in a vacuum. So when that sort of the white supremacist gaze is on the map, it's seeing it one way. Or when the sort of oblivious to racism and social inequality gaze is on that map, it's seeing it one way. But like when we ask ourselves things like, well, who really benefits from open streets? Which communities get access to those open streets and actually benefit from it, and which ones don't? When we really start to think about those things, right, we can make a difference. And I think there is some duty, knowing that social inequality is real, to try to consider what that lens is, to Dishi's point, and consider what the impact would be on other communities. While at the same time, I am really excited by what you're saying there, Felipe, that you just never know what other people are going to see that could be really exciting and could transform the future. It's just a balance, I guess.
Agreed. Yeah.
That was probably really visible in the sidewalk width project, where the projects would put out there, and then the response was, well, this is like not what it looks like in reality, and there's like construction going on, which is because the cities are so dynamic that how do you make a map as dynamic as the city? There's a question from the audience, which is, what communities benefited from these open streets in the New York City? And curious to know who it became more accessible to. So if you could address that.
Yeah, so open streets, so streets were closed to traffic and open to pedestrians across the city. And so the initial legislation just outlined some overall goals and targets, but then it was a kind of a more messy political set of decisions that decided what streets to open to pedestrians in each city council district. And so that was much more lengthy and fraught process. And it's one that I wasn't super involved with. I did provide some updates to the map to show each city council district and some summary statistics there. But ultimately it was all over the city.
And how do you see this going forward? Like, what could this eventually turn into, the project?
Yeah, so this project was really meant to raise awareness and start discussion about our public spaces and how they're designed. People don't think about the infrastructure of streets enough in terms of how pedestrians use them. And so this is really I'm hoping that it sparks more discussions and effort to create more data around public space. And already it's resulted in a whole host of discussions. I've talked with the Department of City Planning. They're very attentive, and they want to know what other data sets that they can add to their open data portal that similarly relate to pedestrians. And so it's really, my hope is that it kicks off a series of conversations that help us move in that direction.
which I believe you've been pretty successful in already, and this capacity for people to then want to read maps. How do we, and I think this is open to everybody here, how can you point to examples of efforts to increase this appetite in the communities to read maps and then take action from that?
Yeah, there's a lot of work by folks at historically Black colleges and universities, particularly Tennessee State University, where not only are they doing projects with students whose work is sort of focused in geography and GIS, but they're taking those projects are in the community, and they encourage a lot of community engagement and encourage folks to look at and read these maps. There's lots of efforts to map historic spaces in typically marginalized social and racial communities. Like there's a lot of efforts to map historic grave sites, which sometimes is the only way to get information about Black ancestry, and to map historic Black towns, which in some ways is about revealing inequities, but largely about revealing like value. And all of these activities and so many others encourage the community to really take a look at their world and their community and what's around them using maps. And hopefully we get to a point where and I think as we're really trying to get there where story maps are just another kind of social media platform and everybody can engage in it.
Felipe, is there anything you'd like to connect this to your project?
Right, yeah, no, I would say that sort of how larger audiences interpret and respond to sort of not just maps, but larger sort of drawings in urban projects is an incredibly important part of the process. And I would say that a part of that interpretation might also involve raising points of discussion and dissent, right? You're not actually going to get everybody to agree on one particular set of drawings or one particular set of readings of a city. But I think putting those on the table as a point of departure to be able to have a larger conversation for me becomes extremely important, even if that might generate a certain level of dissent, which is inevitable in the context of dealing with a public domain.
And I would also add that, so my background is design, and so I'm very interested in making analysis and quantitative analysis accessible through maps, and whether that's in Delve or with the sidewalk widths. It's really powerful if you can communicate quantitative information effectively to a broad audience. And I think web maps allow you to share it widely, although of course the internet has its limitations because not everyone has access to the internet. So, but it is representing a wider audience than in the past.
Yeah, and we probably, projects like the ones you presented here today are exactly that. They're a step in the direction of increasing that appetite in the public. The next question comes from the audience again to Clinton about work that you might have done outside of the US, and if you'd be willing to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can always talk about specific projects, but I'll say some broad general things like Esri Inc. Collaborates with, doesn't necessarily collaborate, but Esri Inc. for one thing works with the nonprofit and global organization space to do work that supports hundreds of countries. And there's also scattered around the world different not satellite offices, but distributors that serve specific regions. So yes, we do this kind of work in other countries. Of course, the context shifts, right? Race as a social construct means that as you move from one geopolitical space to the next, racial identities that you thought you were bringing with you, you can throw out the window, and you've got different challenges and also different availability of data in that regard. But there's lots of work by global organizations to address the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 10, sort of being reduce racial inequities, sort of being foundational to all of the other goals. So yeah, there's lots of work in that regard. It helps when countries have the resources to collect timely and accurate census data, and it also helps when countries are that are capturing that data are interested in exploring the kinds of isms and oppressions that people experience through the lens of social identity, and so therefore are capturing data in that regard. But it isn't often the case that exists, and so sometimes the work is collecting that information to gain some insights.
Right. Mealy, would you be able to point to some work that you might have done outside of the US and how that might be different from how it is in the US? Because of course the data collection practices are very different in every country.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the really interesting things about the Sidewalk with This project is that because there were individual teams across the world that were actually using the code, they were actually able to customize it to their own needs. So things as small as what they're using, the languages that the website is in. They were able to customize all of that, as well as focus on mapping areas that were of interest to them. I think in the case of Italy, there was an advocacy group that ended up mapping the entire country and producing a map for Sidewalk Width for the whole country. And so I think one of the possibilities of open source tech projects is you can distribute how the code in the map actually is used, and you're not necessarily creating hard rules or about how it's used. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Right, that's great. I think that also brings the point of like developing a map that is based on what is happening right now. And then I guess what Felipe showed today was the Sao Paulo project, which is predicting a master plan of what things could be. So my question is, I guess to Felipe, is like, how do you envision that coming to life? And like you said, we don't know what people take away from the maps you show them. So what kind of challenges do you feel will happen by 2035 when that comes into effect?
I think, I think that's a very important sort of question that you're asking, because at the end of the day, I would argue that mapping doesn't give you a design project, right? Mapping gives you a way, it should be simultaneous to design, and it gives you a way to understand a particular set of scenarios. But at a certain moment, I'm a huge believer in sort of the role design expertise actually plays in particular in particular areas, right? In particular sort of projects. And in the case of Sao Paulo, for example, what is absolutely essential is that the city rethinks the role of its river. If you ask anybody at Sao Paulo if the city has two rivers, which it does, most people will say no, it has two dirty canals, right? Because they were always put to the use of industry. It was a very utilitarian relationship to the river. And today that sort of, Sao Paulo is the city that has the largest amount of post-industrial land in the world, right? In restructuring that land, I think there's also a very important mission in rethinking the role of the river. And it might be from moving away from a sort of this utilitarian relationship into one that makes the city a much more, so it makes the river a much more important participant in the civic and urban life of the city. And this is important not just from a sort of a recreational or civic point of view, it's extremely important one from a water management and environmental point of view. Because downtown Sao Paulo and the more central parts of the city do not have the capacity to deal with sort of stormwater management. If stormwater management strategies are not part of a larger project that bring value, and not just sort of financial value, but sort of the quality of urban space value to sort of these central areas. So I think for me, what becomes important here is the way that mapping can actually reveal certain trends, certain information, but then how that is combined with a certain level of disciplinary know-how that puts a way forward, sort of a way forward that can be contested that can be discussed, that can be debated, but that has a certain level of expertise, underpinned by a certain level of expertise.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me. But also recognizing that as we take on work, as using our expertise, we're also using our lived experiences, right? And so where we have lived experience informs where we apply our skills and how we apply our skills. So I think the other side of this equity conversation with regard to planning and design and GIS is how do we bring people not just from other countries, but also from other ethnic identities, indigenous folks, and people from different socioeconomic backgrounds into this work, grow their expertise so they can be active participants in the conversation. And of course, if there are inequities that are making it more difficult for them to engage, and we continue to position the technology as something that requires skill set and expertise, you know, we're in some ways maybe presenting more barriers if we don't marry that with efforts to bring in more people from underrepresented groups.
Yes, for sure. I think both those points of what you abstract and how you make it tangible and who you give that power to kind of come together to make a good project. And I think like this is kind of leading me back to where we started about countries and cities where data is limited, and what algorithm or how do you even go about researching that data? And if you face that challenge in your work.
Yeah, I think the hard thing is sometimes you have to, like Melly did, create it yourself, and sometimes you're deriving it from other documents. And Felipe was talking about like other drawings and documents as data. And I think we need to also think about experience as data. And so figuring out how to transform these things that are unstructured and or just in our hearts and minds into data is important. So activities like participatory geography, GIS, and data science are making some of that easier. Again, of course, it's still sort of focused on those who sort of the haves, right? People who are aware of those capabilities and have some degree of training to use those capabilities. So I'm really interested in trying to partner with folks to empower communities to own the work of creating new data, right? So we're trying to address challenges that just haven't been addressed before. So it isn't going to be that existing data is going to help us, because data is really created and defined around business challenges, someone's specific challenges. Businesses and governments that are trying to provide specific kinds of services and products and build up their resources to do so are creating data towards that mission. So creating data that's really about the mission of equity in communities is something different. So we have to figure out how to dig in and create new data, define data that exists in different ways to gain different insights.
This is probably very relevant at the urban scale at which, Felipe, most of your work has been based. So have you faced any challenges in accumulating this data, either through talking to people and then putting their stories in?
Right. No,
Yeah.
I think that that, of course, especially working in the context that I've worked, access to data is an issue, I would say, on two counts. One is sort of countries that might not necessarily, or sort of cultures where the collection of data might be either different or not sort of in the format that we're accustomed to understanding it, right? But I think also a critical part of that is understanding that maybe the data that has been collected in a particular manner is not giving you the right sort of the information that you're seeking. And that's where I think we also need to be very careful about the technologies that we're using and the answers that are already prescribed by those technologies. And in that sense, a lot of my work, for example, one thing that's irreplaceable in my work is firsthand observation and spending a significant amount of time in these places, right? You wouldn't be able to do it if you don't bring sort of direct experiences, lived experiences, dialogue, right? When we did the when we did the Sao Paulo project, as it was sort of being presented in the form of a book, right? All the contributors that wrote on the book are people that came from many different perspectives, from many different fields. Many people sort of, for example, that came from the field of public health, that were sort of heavily embedded in the city that could speak about the relationship of public health and the transformation of the river and so on. So I think for me, what is extremely important in this situation is to have a hypothesis before you collect the data, right? If you're just going to start collecting data for the sake of collecting data, I think you're going to sort of, in a way, sort of take much longer to get to where you want to go, or not get there at all. That's why I think having a thesis in a particular set of motivations is essential, and that's what should actually drive the different techniques and technologies that you embrace.
But it also probably comes down to how, once you've collected the data, then how do you present it so that people actually act on it? And I think this is very relevant to all your work, especially Clinton's, because racial inequity and racial issues have been around for a while, not just in America, but in every country. And then how do you do something differently that moves somebody enough and propels action?
Yeah, I think that is the thing that we have to accept, that we're not going to find the answers to these age-old challenges by doing the same things. We've got to do new things, and we got to do some of the things in new ways, right? And some of that is to Felipe's point, having some idea of what the issues are. And so we hope that we help by providing frameworks to sort of decompose the landscape of community and the landscape of organizations and their decisions and their impacts on communities in a way that people can start to construct a hypothesis, sort of fundamentally rooted in the hypothesis that decisions and practices by organizations impact the community resources and conditions people are exposed to, which ultimately impact the conditions that people experience. And all of the isms make it such that people are experiencing all of that differently based on their social identity. So with that in mind, empowering people again to just do that new stuff, capture new data. Don't be afraid to do that. Like know that you're going to need new data or to derive new insight from data that exists. And I really love what you were saying, Felipe, about how sometimes what we think of as data is, well, it has to be in a specific format or it's not data. But again, like Melly, you found information that others might not have seen as data, and you turned it into data. Felipe, you're talking about the ways in which engaging directly in community and experiencing, life in other spaces and tapping into their knowledge resources that already exist, and just finding ways to leverage that as data and or transform it into the kind of data that you need to do analysis. I don't know if I helped, but just really excited by some of the things that we're able to talk about in this particular setting.
Yes, I think that's something I completely agree with. Everything that's come out in conversation today has been really good food for thought for everyone in our audience, and hopefully we see some really cool projects going forward. I think we're coming to the end of our time, and we'll start by going around with last remarks. So I think what I'd love to find out is mapping, I think we talked about, is a really good way to show hidden trends that are very easy to miss otherwise. And what is some insight that you drew while researching or working on your projects that really fascinated you and something you weren't aware of before?
I mean, I'll say something that's not very obvious, but is also very obvious. When I entered into the GIS space at Esri, like more fully invested in GIS, what I didn't realize was just like I thought I knew, but just how important your own social identity is in tackling this kind of work in particular. People who aren't typically racialized in ways that harm them have a harder time talking about these issues than anybody else, right? So they're gonna, white folks have a harder time saying the phrase Black people. Straight people have a harder time saying phrases like trans women, right? Like, so all of that impacts the ability that we have to engage in the work. So therefore, for me, it's an imperative around all of this work that in addition to thinking about the tools and the techniques, that we engage underrepresented groups, bring them into these spaces and conversations, give them the space they need and the empowerment they need to share with all of us what we're missing, to help us form new hypotheses that help to change the world in ways that better impact those communities.
Yeah, I will I completely agree with that. And I would also add that, at least for me, one thing that is essential in doing this work is having a genuine sense of curiosity. I think you actually have to be incredibly interested. You need to start with an audience of one, right? You have to be interested in understanding what these processes are. Who do you want to talk to? Who do you want to connect with? To be able to begin to synthesize sort of material in such a way that it doesn't just become a technical experiment, but that you can actually open up a larger sort of a larger argument that might be driven by certain technical imperatives, but that I think has a broader motivation.
Yeah, and I would say I'm just always surprised by when you're able to share and communicate data and analysis in a way that's simple and anyone can understand. It cuts through a lot of misunderstanding in decision-making processes, and you can get a lot of people on the same page very quickly, whether it's the sidewalk width map influencing the open streets legislation, or whether it's in real estate development projects where you're with a group of many stakeholders and you show something like a shadow or daylight analysis. It immediately gets everyone on the same page. And it also, a lot of people's fears about the unknown of impacts evaporates, because now they can see those impacts simulated.
Great. I think this has been amazing. It's been very thrilling for me to have a conversation, and thank you everyone for taking the time. I will now pass on to Francisco Brown for closing remarks of the session.
Hello, everybody. My name is Francisco Brown, aka Pancho Brown. I'm the Director of Communications here at Station Coombe and also a co-chair of the Design Impact event. Thank you so much to our three panelists, Clinton, Melly, and Felipe, and of course to Dishi and Riki to putting all of these things together. I feel that this panel was one of those sessions that remind me of something I really wanted to know, something I would have loved to know, and something that I needed to know. And you all three did that in every possible way. I am sincerely moved and motivated by your work. Felipe's book has been in my desk in the last 4 years. I've been using Melly's open data in the summer for a project that I'm working, and now I just found out about Clinton's North Star that I'll be looking at very closely. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for joining us